I'm Mel.
I'm Sara.
And I'm Beck. And this is We Are Woman.
Today we are joined by Edward Dangerfield. He's the founder of FBR and a leading voice in precision-based breathwork research. Edward brings a rare blend of clinical understanding, nervous system literacy, a lived embodiment in the world of facilitated breath repatterning, and brings all of this to the teaching space. Edward has a beautiful story to tell and is a true embodiment of what it means to live this work. Edward, welcome to We Are Woman. I am very excited to have you here and to have this conversation today. This podcast is a space where we explore the body as truth, the breath as intelligence, and really what it means to come home to ourselves that feels truly safe and embodied. In my opinion, Edward brings an unusual depth to breathwork, a rare combination of lived embodied experience, precision, research and science, and then also a mind that is able to think in very complex and nuanced ways, as well as a very deep understanding of spirituality and so the esoteric side of things. In the teaching space, I know Edward as a unique teacher who is able to bring a variety of lenses and help us understand the body, mind, and spirit in many layered ways. And of course, how the breath becomes a powerful pathway into deeper understanding and embodiment of ourselves. As a friend, I know Edward as an incredibly generous human being, a truly loving heart, a great dad, and someone that is not afraid to hold me accountable whenever I need to, which for me is a true embodiment and understanding also of what it means to have real friendship in life. In this conversation, we explore how breathing patterns shape the way we think, feel, and therefore also behave, what trauma really is in the body, and why integrating emotions like shame is not only challenging, but deeply empowering. This is a conversation for women who are ready to feel more, not less, and to let the breath lead the way. For women that are ready to trust their bodies more fully and allow themselves to be taken away by this beautiful, beautiful practice. Okay, Edward, let's start at the beginning. Can you tell a little bit about your background story and what you originally led you to breathwork?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Sara. My pain and suffering led me to breathwork, so that's the easy sort of place to start, I guess. I think probably like so many people, my story, like from the start, is I've got this for the listeners. I've got this strange, weird hybrid accent, which is an undertone of growing up in the UK and then spending more or less 20 years living in Canada. And so my upbringing in the UK was what I would say like very confusing and mixed. So it was filled with a lot of different polarity that I had sort of have learned to live with. As an example, like I went to a private school, but I grew up in a very poor household. So my parents divorced when I was really young, and my dad continued to financially support and pay for my education whilst I lived with my mum. And so I grew up with my mum and my brother, and then basically had to live with this sort of duality of being like poor in one sense and then viewed as being very wealthy in another, and needing to sort of mentally try and reconcile that. And so I lived with a lot of opposites, throughout my whole childhood that required me to probably create some strange ways of thinking and viewing the world. And then at 18, I went to university, and like a lot of people in that time and that era, as a young British man, I went and studied economic and political development. And my brother had already gone through the path of studying history and went then law and then became a lawyer. And a lot of my friends were lawyers or accountants and living and working in London. And that was sort of the path that was mapped for me, I would say, as opposed to like really what I was longing to do. And at the end of university, I had enough will and defiance to kind of say fuck this, and I left and I moved to Canada. So yeah, early 20s, I moved to Canada, and I became a ski bum. And so yeah, I just basically started working in the restaurant business in Canada. Yeah, the conscientiousness and drive from I guess from school, from private school, and from university kind of made a difference in the restaurant business. I wasn't your standard ski bum, and so at the time in Whistler where I was living, if you showed up for your job, you kept it. If you showed up on time, you got promoted, and it was just kind of the way. So I ended up getting consistently promoted, and then applied for Canadian residency, and then I was in my late 20s. A friend of mine and I, we decided to open our own restaurant. So had a pretty strong entrepreneurial spirit at that time. And then, yeah, I opened my own restaurant. And that's kind of the backstory. And then, so there I am, early 30s. I'm a restaurant owner. I ski a lot. And life was, yeah, hedonistic and enjoyable and pleasurable. And from the outside looked pretty good. You know, I mean, people would have, you know, been really envious to ski 100 days a year and live the way that I lived and travel and all the things, right? And then, yeah, and then I would say like the pinnacle moment where everything changed and what really set me on this new trajectory or new chapter and path that you guys all know me as is I got caught in an avalanche. And that was one of those critical and defining moments where life would never be the same again. After that, I went on a path. I exited the restaurant and then basically had to stare down the reality that I had PTSD and to go through a process of figuring out what that was, yeah, and what that meant whilst in it and living it, and then figuring out what are the possibilities. And we're going back about 13 years now, 12, 13 years, right? At that time, like somatics wasn't hot, you know, no one knew about embodiment, like awareness, like yoga was still just like, no one even cared about mindless vinyasa back then. We hadn't even gone into that phase of it yet, right? So like this is like, I'm living in BC, which is pretty granola. I mean, it's got a lot of similarities to the Byron Bay area, right? And so yeah, I sort of had to piece it together. So my academic side from the economics background went into like intellectualization and reading like the works of Levine and Porges and, you know, Kathy Kane and Bessel van der Kolk, and yeah, sort of integrating a lot of the cognitive and intellectualized experiences. And then I was living, you know, in Canada. I started getting involved in Native Canadian teachings, connecting back to land and ceremony and ritual. And then I started getting into more of Jivamukti, Ashtanga yoga lineages. And then as that was all coming together, I had this incredible and very fortunate experience to go to a conscious connected breathwork journey. And yeah, I would say that was the second moment that really was a pinnacle in the journey that really changed my life. I got to have an experience of watching the mechanisms of the nervous system go through a trauma cycle from the space of the witness whilst being totally incapacitated to do anything about it. So I was like fully in, cognitively knew what was going on and couldn't stop it. And I just like this like full wave of everything ripped through me in with quite some velocity. Yeah. And so that sort of brought me to what was then CCB, right? Conscious connected breathing, the overarching term for connected breath. And then a new chapter started, which has been, yeah, I guess 12 years now. Yeah, which has been this exploration into, yeah, breath and the body. Yeah. And then, yeah, I mean, I guess that's the story is and I mean, there's obviously plenty of other details and there's plenty of other mess in there as well, but that's mostly it.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And yeah, really beautiful hearing the journey of you growing up in an environment with different kind of energies and these different polarities that were simultaneously being expressed there. And then how that then moved into you making choices that were more aligned for you, right? That's what it sounds like. They were more true for you. So there was something deeper in you, it sounds like, if I were to translate it into my words, that was moving you into deeper alignment and deeper authenticity in your own being and in your living. And then that was followed by this experience in the avalanche, which sounds like, yeah, it really blew you away, blew your mind away. And then the explorations in the several modalities. And I love what you're sharing around, yeah, all of the modalities you've explored, right? So from more the scientific lens as well as the more esoteric perspectives, and how you've really learned from so many different modalities and then came to conscious connected breathing as maybe a modality that felt different. Yeah, and you kind of went into that a little bit already. So you already shared that, you were able to be in the breath, be with your body, but also be in still a dual state of awareness is what I would call that. So you were still self-aware while simultaneously going through the experience. And I guess that leads me to my next question, which is, what about that specifically do you feel allows allowed you in that moment, but allows now also this technique of FBR, which is then woven into the conscious connected breathing, allows people to go through what we call a trauma cycle in a safe and effective manner. And maybe as you speak to that, you can also explain the trauma cycle just for people that might not fully be aware of that. But yeah, essentially the question is, what is it about this particular modality that you feel allows people to do that in such a safe and profound way?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I like this. It's very direct. It's good. It's very precise. So yeah, I mean, firstly, the trauma, like if we were to label up like a general trauma cycle, we have a stimulus that requires some quality of response from the body, and then the body creates the response, and it creates an outcome, and then the stimulus is neutralized, right? That's like what we're doing with life. It's how I'm like drinking a tea right now. It's like I want to drink the tea, and then I reach out and I drink the tea and I put the thing down, right? So that's the cycle of like a moment. And we have these moments. Life is a string of moments throughout a day. Sometimes events happen that require something a little bit more than me picking up the glass and drinking the tea, right? And so if we were to take any larger incident that we can then define as creating something like trauma, I'll take a fairly more recent one that's neutral and common here in Bali, like a bike accident I had, right? I was driving along and I got hit from behind. And so my body is going through the process of driving, right? And so that's one process. And then as I get hit, it has to go through a whole new process. And then the energy, the breath rhythm, the energy and the movement that it requires to go through that process is very, very different. And so there's different tensions, there's different breathing rhythms, there's different gripping and fear and thought patterns that are all necessary and healthy to keep me safe as I'm going to slide down and fall and hit the ground. And then after that, what happens is that gripping, holding survival energy then needs to release. It needs to discharge. And that happens through a variety of different ways. But one of them is usually just presence in space, right? It's just given the space and the presence and the ability to just move that and discharge that will release. And oftentimes at the site of an accident, that would be the most ideal that happens, but it doesn't sometimes. Sometimes it happens in the clinic afterwards, where just shaking and discharge will release later. But that's sort of like the trauma cycle. And what I'm looking for or tracking and what we teach is that there is a big event or a stimulus. It creates there's a desired response from the body. So the body mobilizes energy and it either completes it or it doesn't. The idea is that, yeah, we want to get to a space where the body feels like it's completed. Like both there's a thought and a perception that it's over, and the body feels like it's completed. And there needs to be certain breath rhythms, movements, and then releases in both the endocrine system, in the blood chemistry, and then in the brain, for us to basically file that memory as now being in the past and not ongoing. And so what I've come to realize around my own experiences with PTSD and all the clients I've worked with is when we have an event that we still think is going on right now, we still think is running, or we haven't neutralized in such a way that we think there's a higher probability of it happening than there genuinely is, we have a misperception around life. And then we have basically post-traumatic stress in some way. And that's true for all of us, to varying different degrees. Post-traumatic growth also exists. Every time a human touches fire for the first time, they start to code in the memory of that pain with heat. And that becomes post-traumatic growth. It stops us from consistently burning ourselves with fire. And that's really healthy. And so this mechanism is really, it's really good, right? No mechanism in and of itself is bad or wrong. It's just how it's being applied and how it's continually being used, right? So if we frame up this idea of like the trauma cycle in that way, we have these cycles that they're running and we want them to get completed, right? And so then, you know, the common like difficulty that the mind suffers with in our more modern culture and society is that we've got a bunch of these incomplete reflexes and these big events that we haven't had the opportunity to go in and revisit and complete. And what I like about a lot of modalities like touch work, body work, right, is that they get and start to mobilize tissues and they start to work on some of the movement patterns and reflexes. I'll give you the example of like Ashtanga yoga. It works in very specific planes and it works with very specific movements. It creates a lot of stability and safety. But what it doesn't allow for is wildness. It doesn't allow for voluminous breathing into different areas. And so what I found is that if we want to reclaim some of these more difficult experiences of our lives and visit them and neutralize them, we actually need to go into the breathing rhythms and movement patterns that are close enough to them that it elicits the response that we get to feel it again in our system. And my experience of CCB, the first time I experienced a connected breath, I realized very quickly that we were using breath rhythms to elicit memories from the low brain, from like my sub and unconscious, and bring them up into my conscious mind, and then sort of feel them in a way that was either small enough to be safe or big enough to go all the way through. But either way, the support was there for me to have a sense that, yeah, that's done. Like that's over. Either because I'm safe to experience it again, because yeah, I know I could go back in and do it again. Yeah, or because yeah, just you know, it was such an outlying experience that the likelihood of it is so low that I'm going to be okay. And so that's essentially the trauma cycle and what I think needs to happen when someone's got these incomplete reflexes. And that's where body work won't work. And for me, our cognitive processing, our storytelling is really great, but all it does is bring the event to the surface, but it doesn't allow us to actually re-experience it. And so that, you know, talk therapy can be re-traumatizing if we don't have the capacity to actually go in and breathe and feel like all of the sensations and emotions that still got, you know, buffered for that experience until we had the container to go into them again. And so the specific modality that we all get to practice is called FBR. And FBR is basically a synthesis of all of the experiences that have touched me over the last 12 years and is a consistent and evolving practice. Every time I work with someone new, there's a likelihood that they're going to influence the work in some way. And so, yeah, like you kind of mentioned, it's an amalgamation of a lot of different lineages that becomes quite a living thing.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That's so beautiful. And I love FBR so much for that reason as well, in terms of the way you're going to teach it and share it is going to be different and unique than, for example, how I would share it or how Beck would share it or how Mel would share it or any other practitioner. And that's what drew me so much to this technique as well, is that it really allows the creativity of the moment to guide the practice, and the creativity of the moment of as well the breather as the facilitator, as all of the breathing rhythms, maybe sound, maybe all of the variables that are in the space at the same time, they are really guiding the practice. And for me, that is such a unique way. This is how I just remember your teaching, right, Edward? It's like this combination of everything coming together in the one moment, and that is actually the safety that is required, that can elicit a response for someone to go through that trauma cycle in a safe and effective way, because they're actually being met in the moment with precision and clarity and awareness, and then obviously the tools and skills to help someone through that. One question around the sort of the altered state component, which I'm curious about. What do you feel the altered state component does for people to move through the incomplete reflex?
So thank you. Like the altered states, right? Altered or non-ordinary states are states that humans can access that aren't aren't normal. They don't normally occur within our operating window. So sitting and drinking the tea, I don't normally access an altered state, right? When I lived in Canada, I would quite often be accessing states of incredible alertness when I was skiing, as an example, right? And oftentimes humans will choose certain activities because they give them a certain feeling. And so people that tend to explore adrenaline sports, as an example, they love the feeling of aliveness to the point where it becomes addictive, right? There's a rush or an intensity that can come with some of those things. And so certain like humans, we tend to have ranges with which we operate in. When we step out of that range, we start getting into non-ordinary states of awareness. A more accessible one is actually awe, and awe can be accessed quite easily by connection to nature and space. Sometimes if you do a hike in early morning to the top of a peak and you get there at sunrise, there's a moment where awe is used as a vehicle for accessing a non-ordinary state of awareness, right? So if we define these non-ordinary states of awareness as things that are just like outlying from our normal operating procedures as a everyday human. And so these non-ordinary states become interesting because we can access them by changing our breathing rhythm. So when we change our breathing rhythm, we shift the breath rhythm to what it might be if we needed to have the physiology for a non-ordinary moment. So as an example, if I take my breath rhythm into panic or terror, right, I can start experiencing those things in the safety of my home by just changing my breath rhythm. So if I want to feel the same excitement as skiing, I mean, I could just bring on the breath rhythm of what it feels like to be, skiing, right? And so there comes a point where I basically barely need to leave the house, right? Because I'm like, okay, I've just got this full library of breath just totally available to me, and I could start using breath to change my physiology. So those are the non-ordinary states. The non-ordinary states are, I use my breath to mimic or mirror the breath rhythm of how the body would respond to a specific stimulus. And in that moment, I get to experience the reward of that stimulus. And so, I think the importance of that is when we train ourselves to have huge range in the breath, in the nervous system, in the endocrine system, we train ourselves for just like the huge vibrancy of aliveness. Yeah. And so what I love about this technique of FBR is sometimes people have ingrained and entrained physiological blocks to access certain states. And an example of that would be, someone might have a very tight rib cage and diaphragm attachment that stops them experiencing the fullness of an open heart. And what that means is the rib cage and diaphragm is pulled in tightly. The musculature is so conditioned over years that the rib cage, it cannot flare. So that means the intercostal muscles can't expand, and they can't actually get a full breath into the heart. And what that means over time is that interoception, the feeling sense of the heart space, will decrease over time. And literally someone's ability to expand the ribcage and chest and to fill the lungs with breath and to fully feel what it is to feel the heart space is biomechanically, physically, and neurologically decreased. And so we could see that, right? And we could sense it with, say, our hands or maybe some devices and measure it, right? We'd be able to categorically measure the open-hearted nature of an individual. And then we could be like, wow, like this poor person, their fear of their gripped diaphragm, right, which is a latent fear response, is stopping them from really experiencing love. And so then we would be able to, work on the diaphragm, release the attachment points under the rib cage, flare the rib cage more, see the intercostals expand, notice how that impacts like the posterior chain and serratus muscles on the side. And then from that, we can be like, wow, this person has double the lung volume now in the upper lung. And then we could even look at the heart data and see that the heart rate variability is improved significantly. And likely the outcomes of life will improve because they're able to love more.
Yeah. I love that you're sharing that, because that actually resonates a lot with my personal journey. I don't know if you remember, Edward, but the first time I breathed in the Shala breathwork in Bali, was that what I started to realize after a few breathwork sessions was how gripped and tight my whole core area was. Essentially my whole diaphragm, my ribs were tight, and that came through years and years and years of working in the modeling industry and just lots of conditioning around keeping small control, yeah, keeping it all together kind of thing. And so I remember moving into the breathwork sessions in a way that felt so safe and supportive, and just gently starting to loosen that up,
Yeah.
and tapping into so much more potential and freedom and range within myself. And yeah, it was incredibly liberating. I remember after maybe 3 4 sessions, I was like, whoa, I'm high on life, like I'm actually high.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love this. Again, about this,
Mm,
right? Remembering back to it, I think you raised some really good points here, right? And the first one is that it doesn't have to be PTSD, right?
mm,
You asked me like what was your access to breath work, and I'm like pain and suffering, and I associated that to my PTSD experiences of avalanches and a few other things, right? And then you share, like, which is beautiful, right? You share your experience about being in the modeling industry and how the culture of the industry, right, that you are drawn to, enamored by, rewarded for, young and impressionable, and you did very well in it, right? But that industry and how it shaped you and how it shaped your physiology, and then the reclamation process you've gone through over the years, it
mm,
hasn't been the same as mine. It hasn't been this high volume breath route to reclaim, power and agency, all of these things over like the forces of nature or your own bad decisions in my case, right? But for you, it's been this subtle and insidious thing that's just like crept in and closed your heart down, right? And so, yeah, to hear your story and then to see that gentle releasing of the diaphragm and the rib cage, it's much more about you giving yourself permission, yeah, to take up the space here, right?
mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a very big, because I was sort of, it was this paradox, like again, talking to polarities. It was this, on the one hand, I was in stage and therefore taking up space, you can say, or in a kind of seeming sense, I was taking up a lot of space. But in myself, I didn't feel like it, because I felt like I needed to be this person and hold myself very, very in a lot of constriction and control in order to actually be on stage. So there was a lot of conditioning and requirement there. Yeah.
Yeah, like we want you up there. We want you up there. We want everyone looking at you, but we don't want you to be you. We want you to be this ripped, like figure of you that's the only way you're going to be acceptable is if you're that here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Um,
it's incredible how you've deconditioned that physically, like really.
yeah, yeah. It's been it like the physical changes have been profound. Yeah. So for me, there was the opening of the heart space definitely more, but also the dropping deeper into the pelvis and actually feeling just so much more safe in the world has been a very, very big journey actually, and really also moving through. Yeah, you spoke to terror before, layers of terror and fear around losing my identity and safety, because not knowing how to actually be in a world without being in that role or being in those conditions, because it was so subtly ingrained over time through many repeated incidents.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think what I love about FBR, and you kind of you spoke to it as well, is it's as we embody and integrate more different breathing patterns, which we can do. The breath is the only system in the body that is both voluntary and involuntary. So we actually have a lot of agency and power to really reclaim these different aspects of ourselves. And because it's through the breath and it's sort of natural, right? It's not forced. And I might want to go into that a little bit later, because there's also a lot of breathwork techniques that might feel a bit more forced. And why is this technique not forced is what I would love to explore in a moment as well. Yeah, and how we reclaim these different patterns is ultimately about feeling safe in the different expressions of ourselves. So me, even, for example, I spoke to terror, and initially when that came up, there was an inkling of like, ooh, this is a very big energy. I need to somehow control it or manage it, like that. Even though I knew about the work and I knew about Peter Levine's work and I knew about like allowing it to move through, but actually I've now come to more of a full embodied place of actually it's just about me feeling safe with the energy and knowing that I can hold it in my system, and now I can hold myself whilst the energy might be there. And what has happened for me over time with that, through a variety of different practices, but FBR definitely being one important component of that is that the energy still emerges, but I'm bigger than that. So my sense of self is bigger than the energy. Whilst prior, the energy was just bigger. It would just take over my whole sense of self.
I really like what you're saying around, your ability to you essentially what I'm hearing is you've neutralized fear around the feeling, right? What you've done is you've gone in and you felt the feeling gently at first and been like, ooh, this is big, right? And then you've gone in again and you're like, oh, and then finally you're like, I can hold this as well. And that sounds like a big process of reclamation for you.
I think for what it is allowed for me is really empowering, just very empowering. And actually through the reclamation of fear, I feel less afraid. Obvious. I mean, you can say that's an obvious thing, but also it is an obvious thing, but also it's this paradox again. It's like you don't necessarily want to feel fear, or I don't necessarily want to feel fear. I mean, I don't know about any other human that wants to feel that, right? But by actually wanting to feel it and allowing it to move through and actually almost going after it, you can say, or like being like, yes, this is here, I welcome it in, it neutralizes somewhat. Or it might still be there, but it doesn't take over in that same sort of way.
Yeah, the complexity of your fear here is that you weren't scared of nothing, you were scared of terror. And being scared of terror makes sense. And so terror, in the sense that you engaged with it, is very similar than the terror I experienced in my avalanche. That was terror that I was experiencing. And I think we ought to have a healthy, respectful fear of terror. But we also ought to understand it and know it, right? And so it's the lack of understanding of our own terror that creates the fear. And I think when you embody it, it's not a cognitive understanding or knowing of your terror. What you did, you actually befriended it. I think you actually learned to love it. And what love, in this real sense is not a pushing away of it. It's not the avoidance of it. It's the like, terror happens occasionally in life. It's not something I really want, but if it does emerge, I can love and hold that as well. Well, that's liberation.
Yeah, it's very empowering and liberating for sure. I just want to circle back to this point that I was kind of alluding to earlier, which was around why is FBR and this technique and in the way where we use a conscious connected breath as well, why is it different than many other breathwork techniques? What makes it different? And particularly, I've spoken to a few a few people that might say, I don't want to explore breathwork so much because they have had very intense experiences in the past where they were pushed too far, too fast. And yeah, just curious if you can speak to what makes FBR different and why is it actually safe? And therefore you can say nervous system informed and or trauma informed, even though we use that word quite lightly as well.
Yeah, I love this. I like, yeah, in my sense, like the labels like trauma informed or any of those sort of things, they're ways to try and convey, meaning, right? And they don't really do a very good job because they've been so co-opted by so many people now, especially, on short form platforms, right? And so I think if we want to convey really the value of FBR, I want to just ask you, because I'm actually really enjoying hearing your voice as well. I want to ask you, what was it about that experience in the Shala that allowed you to feel met? Because those are the words that you used. You said, I felt met.
If I now reflect back on it, not that I necessarily was very clear on it at the time, but if I reflect back on it now, I think it was an intuitive sense that I was in the space with practitioners, like a group of practitioners, but particularly yourself, that was going to able to hold me in many different states and experiences. I don't think I knew that cognitively. I think my body just kind of knew that now that I reflect back on it, right? Because I didn't only feel safe, I felt very deeply seen and understood in my experience, beyond sort of the words of I understand you kind of, or the language around it, or the cognitive side of thing, but it was like I have an intuitive sense that I'm in a space here with someone that has gone through an experience like yourself, like through life experience, a variety of life experiences, and that gave me a deep sense of trust. I think ultimately it came down to that, like just this deep sense of trust that I can let go a little bit of my protectors, and in that the intelligence of the breath and the body could emerge out of that trust. I think it was that.
It's so wonderful to hear and receive that, and that for me just sums up so beautifully the essence of FBR. It's about the actual practitioner being able and willing to attune moment to moment to the needs of the client and meet them in what is needed in support and containment through hands or verbal encouragement or direct verbal cues to allow what is the emergent energy that wants to be expressed to come alive without then gripping, looping, or getting stuck in it. And essentially what it is it's a human that will guide you back into your terror safely, right? That's one of the things it is, right? And so it requires us to acknowledge that the technique is just more about humans meeting life moment to moment together than it is about hand placement here or an answer call and response in the way that you use language there. It's very much like, as a human, do you have the robustness and the dynamism to stay with your client regardless of what's emergent? And you felt that deeply in your body, and that's what allowed you to go deeper.
Yes. This is I love that you're sharing this, because this is very much now the essence of how we teach FBR. Obviously, we do bring in the more technical components of, if we put our hand here, this might happen, or like this is what it can mean, or elicit, or something like that. And there is, in the body work and the cues that we give, there's a technical component, but it's actually the essence of it is the intuitive felt sense of being present in the moment and trusting that the moment will facilitate itself. And that requires also a practitioner that is deeply trusting in themselves. Like it requires someone that is not going to already project their own biases and perspective and lenses and preferences of how this person in front of them is going to experience this breathwork session. And I actually think that is the main difference between pushing people beyond their boundaries and beyond their capacity into maybe too much volumes, breath too rapid, too quick, versus that just not happening because it's attuned. Like the other option is just very misattuned. So if we
very misattuned could be high volume breath, but it could be low volume breath. And this is where this idea of deep levels of attunement is actually looking at the system, looking at its conditioning and being like, but it's just conditioned for this again. I don't want to do the same thing. I want to give it something new as a stimulus, as a way that it could live and breathe, right? When we have very high volume or yang people coming into spaces, we don't want to give them high volume yang breath. We want it to be soft and gentle, because guess what? That's what they avoid. And so, that's essential.
So it's this combination of, we are guiding people into different breathing rhythms, feelings, emotions, thinking patterns and behaviors. And at the same time, we're really honoring where the human is at in the moment as well. And it's in the actual honoring that the different pattern can start to emerge. Does that make sense how I'm just wording it?
And what we're doing is, instead of having, my agenda would be wholeness, if it's going to be anything, right? That means the ability for the client to be comfortable enough, in all states. Like that would be great, right? If we get comfortable in all states. And the reason, I train in breath and on the mat is so that when life happens, and it does, I have, the ability to stick with it, to stay with life. And so, I want that for my clients as well. I want them to have a robustness. I want them to have capacity. And that doesn't just mean that they're tough and rigid. It means that they're actually very malleable and dynamic. It means that they'll also go into collapse as well if that's what's required in the moment, that would be accessible and welcomed.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that we really speak to. It's there's not one right way to breathe. There isn't. Nor there is a right way to feel or think. It's all about how are we responding to the moment, and is it appropriate? Is it appropriate to what's arriving in the moment? And that brings me actually to this lens of right relationship
Yes.
with the moment, with ourselves, and all of these layers we can explore within that.
I love this. Yeah. And this, I remember recently at a teaching moment in a container where I was describing this concept of right relationship, right? And Vern, my native Canadian teacher, when he explained this to me, he said, well, life's all about right relationship. And of course, my conditioned, at the time conditioned, Disney mind goes to like, romantic relationship. Like that's what immediately I'm like, oh yeah, right relationship. And he's like, and by relationship, I mean my relationship to all things, my relationship to water, my relationship to food, to the land. And I started to recognize the relational nature of life. I started to recognize that I was in relationship to everything. And it wasn't in exploring me that I found more peace. It was in exploring the relationships that I could find more peace. I could understand the relationship between myself and the ground, myself and my food, myself and my friends. And as I explored the relationships, I started to understand the movement of energy. And in understanding the movement of energy, I recognized where I had control and influence and where I didn't. And that started to create a lot more peace, but also like what you talked about, empowerment.
Yeah, I love that. I like when we had an ESB recently here in Baren, and we asked this question, which we often ask at the very beginning of the ESB, which is we just start at the very basics and we ask, what is breath? Like, what is it, right? Because before we go into all of these maybe terms and terminologies and all of these things, we just want to start with the basics. And I feel like the indigenous here also in Australia really can do that so profoundly, to just keep it simple, but in the simplicity is the wisdom and the profoundness actually. And
Yes.
we asked this question, and there was one of the students that said, breath is interdependence. And I just loved that answer. And it kind of speaks to what you're saying around breath is the relationship with the internal and the external, if you will. And it is that very life connection, if you will. And it's the interdependence of that ultimately has us experience life and ourselves in particular ways. Yeah.
Exactly. I love this.
What is your deeper vision for FBR as a lineage and as a learning space? What is it that you're hoping to, bring about maybe in the upcoming year or few years? But as a technique, but also what's your deeper hope for humanity through this technique as well?
Wow, it's a bold question. I love it. I've struggled, honestly, over the last 5 years immensely with direction and with the technique and with what we're doing. I think in the relational nature of it, every time I have students come through, they kind of really pressure me to more deeply define what we're doing here, which I love and welcome. The teachings have started to become what I would say well-formed, like well-formed enough to the point that where we could start to define them a little bit better with language. That's probably one of the first times I've ever said that, right? I think as you know, but I mean for everyone out there, we don't have a manual, and what that means is we rely on teaching through human transmission. And I love that way. It will always be the foundation of the way that we teach FBR. That means it has to be in person and using touch and training touch, because if you're learning touch, you have to be touching. That's as simple as that. But I suppose like I have a sense now that FBR is well defined as like a technique and a group of principles that we can actually start talking about, right, and writing down. And so what I see right now, the timing of the podcast is interesting. There's a huge shift that's about to occur in my world around a reevaluation away from essentially working so much with one-on-one clients and in any way training teams myself, my focus now is to work with 70 or so FBR practitioners that we have trained globally. And so my focus is to continue to deepen and expand those that have already trained. I'm really, right now we're at a unique position with the school where in Europe we have Pete, is training teams out of Berlin, and in Australia you and Dan are training. And that puts me in a new position where, thankfully, with some relief, I don't train the first 400 hours anymore. And that feels really good. I'm sort of now in this position where I train like from hour 350 to hour 400. And like in full transparency, I'm getting weird. Like a decade ago, I was new in the work and we were exploring, and I was quite relatable. And now I find, in a very, sort of eccentric and eclectic way, I like the fact that as I start entering firmly into middle age now, I'm getting fucking weird, right? And what that means is for someone to walk in off the street and be taught by me can be a bit sort of confusing and or confronting. And so it's kind of nice to have buffered me with a good 350 hours of study before you come into one of my learning spaces. So for me personally, FBR is about to go through this evolution of a deepening. Yeah. And so the broadening is now happening with the 400-hour in Oz in Europe, which I love seeing. And that feels really aligned for building these communities of practice with great standards and good integrity and frameworks to support. My focus right now, moving into this next chapter, which is probably going to be about, well, I would say, like, let's just call it 5 years for fun, right? Is going to be how can I support the people, the FBR practitioners that are already out in the world doing good work. And so that's sort of now my refocus. And then, for the body of work, what that means is, like, for me, I wouldn't say like my skill set's going to evolve or change much. And I think that's the first time that I've really said that. I've at a point after over 10 years of working with this technique that I'm thinking like, this is pretty concrete now in the fundamentals, right? There'll be bells and whistles, and if I work with a breath system, I'm always looking at it sometimes as a puzzle. There's always going to be more puzzles, right? But I don't think the way I'm solving the puzzles is going to change much. And that feels really new. I suppose what that feels like is I have encountered enough humans, enough breath systems, and I've failed enough and had to solve enough problems over and over again that I actually finally have got to a place where I feel quite competent in my ability to meet people, like to really genuinely meet people and systems well, consistently. And so now I suppose finally there's a sense of confidence that I would like to share more of that. And kind of what that looks like is more depth with the team that already has trained and exists. So my mind sort of starts to look at what does that look like very personally as well. Like my son just turned 7. Cheering him on X Legend. And in childhood development, something changed for me when he turned 7. Something changed for me cognitively as a milestone. It was probably like both a letting go, but also a softening back. And I think also my ability to start to travel might increase as well, either with him or will just change. So I'm just sort of exploring what that looks like now in chapters. For me, I orientate a lot of my life around my son. He's 7, so I've got 11 years being close to him, where that will be, which will probably be in Bali. And so I think about how I can kind of plan my schedule around his life, because that's probably my highest priority.
Yeah, thank you. That's beautiful. And I think that is a big statement actually from you to hear, Edward, that you feel like competent in this work. And you always felt like confident and felt like you can explore different layers. But I know you as someone that is kind of never ending, like there's always something more to explore, to discover in something, right? So for you to say that, I know that is quite a big statement. So thank you for sharing that. And if I just looking at you now, it feels like a nice exhale and an arriving at a new chapter that maybe feels a bit more spacious, and Deepening. Yeah, I love that. And well, I'm very happy that I'm one of those practitioners that's already done the training, as well as Mel and Beck here. So I think we're all very excited to be part of that group that can actually deepen the practice more, and so that we can then share the ripple effects of this work with so many more people in Australia mainly, and also for particularly the women that might be listening. Yeah, very excited to share this work more and to support the body, the health, the thriving of spirit more fully into our embodied forms. Yeah. Do you have any last words, Edward, before we close out this conversation?
As you spoke there, it was just sort of what came alive for me as well was this realization that I've trained so many fucking incredible humans. I think there's probably it's been over 100 that have come through the program. I would say that are working actively with FBR. We're probably around like 60 to 70 somewhere in the world.
Hmm.
And yeah, just there's been this. It's been a wonderful depth to get to know people as they've come through the training process, and I've sort of been trapped, to be honest with you, between a process of loving the depth of intimacy and the knowing of these people, and then the immense grief that I feel when they leave. And so, what feels really nice is the possibility of just focusing on right relationship with those people that are already here, and just being like, yeah, what would it like a dream of mine? What would it look like for those 70 people to come together and to share breath and food and stories around where they're at now, and to sort of celebrate. So I think, yeah, as I'm speaking, it is obviously coming alive as a vision right now, to celebrate what's going to be the closing of a chapter and the opening of a new one. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I felt your words resonating. It's like that's something I've been calling in life more as well. It's just a deeper intimacy and a simplicity, and really nourishing the people that I'm already in relationship with, and span less, so more depth. And yeah, so thank you for sharing that, and hopefully we all get to come together to celebrate that. Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
very good.
Yeah, let's let the magic continue. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, guys.
Edward, thank you for your depth and your clarity, and also the incredibly beautiful way that you described this practice and the way that it's touched your life as well as so many others. The integrity and the precision that you bring to this work is truly inspiring to me. And really, this conversation, again, like any other conversation with you, I feel like this conversation again feels like a remembering, a deeper remembering of what the practice is about, the ancient wisdom that it carries, as well as this really deep and profound scientific lens. And thank you for, yeah, your openness around your experience as well in the avalanche, and how that's really shaped you coming to this practice, and how it's now having such a beautiful ripple effect into so many people's lives. I'm really excited also to share that our next practitioner training is starting in April. That will be held in Baren for the first two segments. And the last segment we will need to see still where that's going to be. But the first two segments will be held in Baren by Dan and myself. And yeah, we're really excited to go deeper into this practice with a bunch of people that are super keen and super willing and ready for this kind of quality of work, for the precision, the depth, the nuance that this work really brings. It's so much more than a typical quote unquote practitioner training where you learn a bunch of stuff. It's really a deep personal development journey, really, that the three of us have been on and that we continue to go on. So if you're up for a deep transformational journey that includes so much learning about the practice, and then of course at the end of the practitioner training, the ability to share that work with others as it may have touched you in so many ways, and allowing it to touch so many others in so many different ways as well, then reach out to us. Thank you again for being here on the podcast and for listening in. I'm very excited to share more conversations with Edward. We will have more conversations with him in the future. And thank you for being here.
So that's all from us today. Thank you so much for tuning in to We Are Woman. I hope today's conversation gave you something to reflect on, to feel into, or to carry with you into the rest of your week. Please make sure to click subscribe on your favourite podcast platform so you never miss the latest episodes as they drop. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a woman that would find it helpful, because this isn't just our podcast, it's all of ours, together. You can also follow us on Instagram at We Are Woman Podcast to stay connected, share your thoughts, and join our growing sisterhood. We've got some very special events planned and would love for you to be a part of them. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being exactly who you are.